A couple of months ago, an internal government memo was leaked. So this was a letter between Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, and the Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Rayner had sent Reeves a list of proposals on how she could collect more tax. And it's number 4 that we care about today. Continuing to freeze the additional rate threshold in cash terms, rather than uprating it with inflation from 2028, could raise revenue and would be consistent with the manifesto. Before you dismiss this as, oh, that's just really high paid people, it doesn't affect me, what this memo shows is the government's willingness to use a form of taxation that for 40 years was described as unauthorised, unintended taxation by stealth. It's responsible for the largest tax increase imposed on the British public since the 1970s. It's happening right now, and it affects anyone who earns more than £12,570 a year. If you earn at least 15k a year, this is costing you a minimum of £530 per year in extra tax. But this tax is invisible. You cannot see it with the naked eye, but it's hitting all of us. I've wanted to make this video for a while, but today I want to show you the damage that fiscal drag has done to us all. But most of all, ahead of the next budget, where I fear that Labour will be tempted by fiscal drag again, I want to shine a light on the fact that workers across the earning spectrum have already paid their fair share.
This is why the politicians do it, because they think we're too thick to understand.
In the tax year 1991-1992, just 3.5% of UK adults paid the 40% higher rate tax of income. By 2022-2023, it was 11%. In the next 2 years, it will hit 14%. I could position that one way. I could say, look, all of these Brits that weren't earning enough in the past to pay higher rate taxes now are. They must be doing better than they were in the 90s then. So why doesn't it feel that way? How can 1/4 of teachers be forecast to hit higher rate tax, an increase of nearly 5 times from 1993, yet the sector is described as poorly paid versus others? In the mid-90s, basically no nurses paid higher rate tax. Now 1 in 10 will by 2027-28. Jobs have changed over time. A lot of nurses today act like doctors in many ways, so of course their pay goes up. But it also highlights this trend that in the past what were considered not high-paid roles are now in higher rate tax brackets. Let me just give you an oversimplified example of fiscal drag in effect. Let's say we have a lady called Sue, earning 50k a year in 2022-2023. That 50k number is convenient for this example because it sits right near the line where you start paying 40% tax. If Sue's income crosses this line, she starts paying that higher rate of tax. In that year, 2022, inflation spiked at around 11%. But for the simplicity of this example, let's just call it 10%. That means if Sue stays on 50k earnings, she is poorer because everything around her has got more expensive by on average 10%. She needs a pay rise just to keep her current standard of living. Let's say she got that pay rise, 10%, an extra 5k added onto her pay packet every single year. But then that income has to be taxed, doesn't it? The issue is most of that 5k now pushes her into a higher tax bracket. She's going to be taxed at the 40% tax rate on that gain. So the 10% pay rise designed to allow her to keep up with inflation is less effective as it's taxed at that higher rate. Sue now pays more tax to the government in total, but is worse off financially than before all of this started. We should all be protected from fiscal drag by a process called indexation. All that means is that the tax bands, so the tax-free personal allowance, the higher rate, and even the additional rate should all go up by the rate of inflation each year. And I don't mean out of some kind of moral principle, I mean because of law. This is the Finance Act of 1977. If we go to page 12.22, section 2, here it is. In the year 1978 to 79 and subsequent years, the personal reliefs allowed in this section shall be changed by not less than the same percentages increase in the retail price index. That is saying that we have to uplift income tax thresholds by inflation each year. It's called the Rooker-Wise Amendment. Named in part after this man, now Lord Jeff Rooker, who at the time was a 36-year-old backbencher who managed to force these 3 lines into that act. Probably some of the most consequential tax legislation to protect the purchasing power of normal people in this country ever. And for decades, we stuck with it. Here's another great read. So Personal Tax Allowances and Reliefs 1997-1998 from the House of Commons Library. Let me just read you a section of this. Personal allowances should be increased by a percentage equivalent to the rise in the retail price index, RPI. And in the main they were. Throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, we saw a pretty consistent uprating of the thresholds. Now, there were big chops and changes to the rates of taxation and what was paid by who. As an example, Gordon Brown removed the lower rate 20% in 1999. He replaced it with the starting rate, which was 10%, which he then scrapped in 2008. But the amount of income that you needed to earn to fall into a specific band tended to move up with inflation over this time. Lots more people entered higher tax brackets during this time, but this was because wage growth was strong over the period. That changed post-2008. Additional rate tax was introduced by Labour, then George Osborne did something pretty interesting. He increased the personal allowance but decreased the basic rate threshold. At a time, the inflation rate was above zero. The Rooker-Wise Amendment still existed, but George Osborne just legislated on top of it as a temporary measure. But this has set a precedent that's proven all too tempting for modern politicians in hard times, leading us to today. The personal allowance and higher rate thresholds have stayed virtually unchanged since around 2019 and 2020. And the additional rate tax bands went the other way. They came down. Rishi Sunak froze the bands in the government reaction to COVID-19. At first, it was set to go on till 2026. It was then extended to 2028 by Jeremy Hunt. Just look at what's happened to the share of adults moving into higher tax bands since its introduction. When Labour took office, they said, we inherited this freeze, but we won't extend it. Then we've got Angela Rayner, hinting at maybe they just might. I can see why it's tempting. They get to claim and sit there going, we haven't raised taxes whilst also collecting billions more in tax revenue. They get to have their cake and eat it. The House of Commons Library published OBR forecast data, which shows how the expectation of how much they would raise from fiscal drag has exploded over time. In 2021, they estimated that it would raise about 8 billion a year by now, but just 3 years later, the figure is actually 27 billion. By 2029-2030, simply keeping the tax bands frozen is expected to raise nearly 40 billion a year, 38.6 billion. That is 4 times the original estimate. It would be similar to the amount of money that you get if you combine inheritance tax, alcohol duty and tobacco duty into one. If we spread it evenly across every household in the UK, it's about £1,359 per household every year from 2029. But obviously, it's not spread equally. Everyone who pays income tax will pay a portion towards that. People who are higher earners will pay more of it. If you're a basic rate taxpayer, someone who pays 20%, this has cost you because the point at which you start getting taxed should have risen. If the rate had been uplifted in line with inflation, the OBR thinks it would be sat at £15,220 in tax year 2024-25. The fact that that band has not changed costs anyone earning over £15,220 around £500 a year. When it comes to the higher rate threshold, there's a few ways that we can assess this. The OBR think it would have increased to £61,020, which is almost £11,000 higher than it is currently. So you pay an extra 20% tax on that difference. In 1997, the higher rate threshold was just £30,200, which is lower than today's average median income. If we uprated that figure for inflation since 1997 using RPI as a measure as was originally intended, the 40% tax threshold would kick in at £76,632 today. Or as a final measure, if you want the same percentage of people to pay higher rate tax as did in the 90s, well then the higher rate tax band would need to be near to £100,000. What's that, like 10k a year in extra tax or something? Whatever measure you use for the higher rate band, the portion of income that hasn't been uplifted is subject to 40% instead of 20%, as well as a whole host of other taxes, but it equates to thousands of pounds a year in difference. At the additional rate, the one the memo champions, it gets even uglier, because they've seen a reduction in the band at a time that inflation ran wild. Regardless of the narratives around this group, they have seen a huge increase in their tax burden in recent years. Let's not forget the tax traps that exist, like the one at 100k, the removal of personal allowance, childcare support, things like this. And I'm just talking about income tax here. I haven't talked about other areas. In the policy costing document from the autumn 2024 budget, they listed loads of different bands that were frozen. Fiscal drag has gone mainstream. Is it honestly any wonder that people don't trust politicians? Even if you don't know why, it's like what they say doesn't make sense versus your lived experience. And I think fiscal drag is an example of this. I made this video because the other day I heard Keir Starmer say this about the next budget.
That'll all be set out in the budget, but the focus will very much be on living standards and making sure people feel better off.
How can you honestly sit there with a straight face and say you want people to feel better off when you know that this is happening in the background and will continue to happen? Look, it's easy for me to sit here and criticise politicians and bash them over the head, isn't it? I don't have to do their job and they have a very hard job, and maybe if I was doing their job, I would make the same decisions as they are to keep power. I don't know, I would like to think that I wouldn't, but Maybe I wouldn't even get the job then as a result. But what's also clear as well, or what I want to make clear, is we can't just whack up the personal allowance, say, to 20k like Reform have suggested. It's not feasible at this point. It would just simply cost too much. In that way, the damage has been done. What I think we need to do, though, is really resist the urge to continue down this fiscal drag route. I want to show you why by coming back to this chart again. The OBR often make predictions that don't pan out. But this one here is a doozy, isn't it? I mean, you thought it'd be 8 billion, but oh no, it's 27. But to be fair to them, it's not completely their fault. Freezing tax bands lets inflation dictate your tax policy. And as we know, the UK doesn't have a grip on inflation all that well. If inflation spikes, politicians will sit there and go, we couldn't have seen this coming, it's not our fault, but at the same time they'll collect more in tax revenue due to fiscal drag. So clearly, this is a tax policy that is not planned out that well, because you're at the mercy of a factor that they claim that they can't always control. This is the importance of the 1977 tax ruling. It meant that tax changes had to be transparent and well thought out. The Rooker-Wise amendment kept politicians intentional and honest. They had to stand there and say, face to face with the public, I'm raising this tax and why. Fiscal drag is the complete opposite. It's a stealth tax. And look, stealth taxes, they are nothing new. They've been a tool of politicians for many a year now. But the scale of the ones that we're living through at the minute as a result of high inflation are unprecedented. Today I've only focused on income tax because it's the most egregious example of fiscal drag in our modern economy. It's worth saying I've not mentioned Scottish tax rules today, which are different. To be honest, fiscal drag applies across the board to many different groups. I could sit here and point to the self-employed, to contractors, to basically workers, and I'm calling a worker anyone who gets up each day and goes out there and works for a living. I could say that it's impacted all of them in measurable, big ways. I often think that in the UK, our media and our political system pits workers against each other, and that's not where the focus should be. And yeah, I understand that someone on 20k a year and someone on 200k a year, that there's a stark difference in their income level. But what I hope I've shown you today is that actually, as a group, workers across the earning spectrum in recent years have all paid more than their fair share in extra tax. I'll be making a video ahead of the next budget on how we might look to raise tax revenue without hammering this group further, some suggestions for the Chancellor, if you will. I'll explore wealth taxes and how feasible they are, but I'm also going to look at other areas of taxation that maybe we could lean on to raise some more revenue, if we concede that that's what we need to do. I know there's going to be lots of people sat at home going, we don't need more revenue, we need to cut spending. But if that's the route of travel, I want to look at ways that we can do that without hammering this group anymore, because I believe that they've paid enough. For this video though, the message is clear. Next time you hear a politician say that we're not raising tax on workers, but they're freezing tax bands, just call BS on the massive gaping black hole in that logic.